is the last part of our conference here on adapting institutions, a comparative studies perspective. And this last slot is a panel discussion between the 5 of us here, and should deal with the question, what can comparative area studies do for the study of institutional change? But we added a further question, not least because Frau Pragua is here, and what can comparative area studies also do for reflecting and potentially ameliorating the practice of institutional reform? What does it mean for practitioners? And let me just briefly introduce as well the panelists here. Already mentioned is Claudia Pragua from the Federal Ministry of Cooperation for Development Cooperation, and we have here as well Professor Berg-Schlosser from Marburg University, Laurence Whitehead, Oxford University, Nuffield College, and Ariel Ahram, Virginia Tech. Thank you for joining us here on the panel. Let me start off this discussion by tackling that further question for practitioners. So just my take on this briefly is that, yes, of course, comparative area studies could be essential also to ameliorate practice. I would claim that context sensitivity matters not only in academia, but probably as well in practice and conceptualizing the right policies. Institutions have predecessors, they are embedded in a certain context in areas that have their specificities, and you have to know probably also the past to design the future. And there's little gain for practice in general findings, a worldwide trend, an average result, if you have to deal with very concrete situations. So this little gain is probably of interest. Comparing may also help in practice to find the right solutions. That at least is what I'm convinced of, but I don't know how practitioners look at it. And maybe from our discussions during that conference, I don't know whether your image has changed or was always very positive, so I just pass on the word to Claudia Pragua.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you refer to my image of GIGA, it was positive and it's further positive, I can assure you. No, thank you very much for organizing this conference. I think it's a very, very interesting event for us, not only for academics, but also for the practitioners in development policy and the experts on the ground. And that you put the question of how do institutions function and what are the triggers for institutional change in the focus is really of highly relevance for our development cooperation. Maybe you all know it's a sort of historical change or a chance now. We have in 2015 the duty to define the new development goals. The UN has started a process because we had a lot reached during the development process, but not everything has reached. We have the debate of development effectiveness, and we have also different partner approaches to deal with the question, how do institutions function? And it's, I think, in the core of development cooperation, the question, what do we know about institutions and about how they function? And maybe I come from the other side. Normally, every donor is quite familiar with different sorts of analysis instruments. GIGA and BMZ, of course, are already cooperating in the so-called short political analysis. We have the common product of early crisis warning system be developed. And I must say, coming from the regional department in our ministry, I can state that there is a sort of competition between different sort of analysis. And being a practitioner who has the duty to design policy programs, we are looking for instruments which overcome the weakness of the existing instruments. And to be honest, even in the OECD context, in the EU context, everyone is used to do analysis, but we also know there are certain limitations for the traditional sort of analysis. We know the more detailed the information is, a political analysis has, you less can use them because these are sensitive informations in analysis. We have the problem that many of the informations are not practical. Our colleague in the regional department asked us, what do I do? How do I address the right persons? And I think the main challenge is, who is the driver of change? Who is the spoiler? Where does the money go? and who do I sequence the right intervention in what sequency? And maybe an added value of area studies, area studies could be to identify general trends, to make the whole complex analysis system more simple, more operational. But it's only a wish from my side. I'm not sure whether this would be your answer as well.
Also not sure, but maybe Dirk Berg-Schlosser has also a view on this, please.
Well, I think we all learned a lot about, in a substantive sense, about processes of democratization in different forms and possibilities of conflict resolution. And the question is, what do comparative area studies add onto this as a kind of an added value as far as our potential insights are concerned? And this has a theoretical and a methodological side, and I'll come to that in a moment, but I also think it does have some practical implications. As we have been talking in between, much of the information you at the ministry or other big organizations like OECD or others at the EU level are getting is based on case studies, individual country studies, or often on very global or cross-country statistical analyses, mostly from the economist side and for institutions like OECD, etc. Here I think we can provide a kind of middle way, which doesn't mean it's always the royal way or the golden way, but it does have some added advantages. And in this sense, and this metaphor was used very often, it's also a hybrid way. But I'm not insisting on this. But I think it depends on the kind of research design involved with that cross-area perspective. And this combines, on the one hand, much deeper empirical insight into a number of cases and a number of regions or sub-regions within larger regions, plus it extends the validity of our insights and findings. It's not a global insight, but it's in between somewhere. And we can, on this basis, for example, more precisely find out or define what we mean by regions. When we talked about the processes of diffusion, it turned out some of these diffusion processes are confined by regions, but in a political sense. Like in Eastern Europe, when we had this strong process of diffusion after the fall of the wall, within a few days, most of the post-communist regimes or the communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed. But then this wave went on to Africa and parts of Asia. So we can see how certain diffusion effects are limited by, in fact, existing boundaries. And we had also in our papers, we had so in this respect, we can learn from intra-regional comparisons and extend them to some other or possibly several other regions to see are there counterfactual examples. So this would be the first way of dealing with it in a methodological sense. When we talked about Islamization in the Middle East and the prospects there, immediately some counterfactual examples in other parts of the world came up, and this can potentially enrich our substantial insight, but it's also important for the implications for policies. The second kind of design we have is a kind of a two-area or two-region or sub-region comparisons, extending it. We had examples from the southern part of Latin America, the Cono Sur, compared to 3 francophone countries in Africa. And again, we saw a number of similarities, but also a number of differences. And this is also a design to find out how far do our concepts travel, what are our added insights, and in which way can we then, to some extent at least, be more secure about our hypotheses and our theorizing. And the third kind of design would be even more ambitious in a way, but then specifically testing particular hypotheses across a large cross-area perspective, not just two regions, but possibly at least the major regions in the world. Like I was involved in one comparative project where we compared the, relatively speaking, most successful democracies in different regions of the world after the last wave of democratization in the early 1990s. And we took Chile from Latin America, South Africa after 1994, South Korea for the Southeast Asian region, Poland for Eastern Europe, and Turkey for the Middle East. And then we looked at, are there any commonalities across these relatively successful democracies? And if yes, what are these? And so in this way we can, reduce complexity very much and isolate a number of crucial factors involved in such processes. And so in this respect, it's not the ideal way, but it's a good middle road we can pursue.
Yeah, during this conference we had obviously also very different perspectives on that question of how to do comparative area studies. Maybe many things are allowed, maybe there are also do's and don'ts. I don't know whether Laurence Whitehead has a take on this.
Well, I was going to follow the point about, I think that we've got two questions, which is about the practical and then the more theoretical. On the more practical side, I mean, it's a very straightforward thing that academics can say to donors and institutions. If you don't understand the context you are engaged with, you are more likely to get unintended consequences. And more specifically, because of the subject of our conversations here, you can't assume that the institutions you're dealing with in a particular region are, or they may be called the same thing, but they don't have the same meaning, and they don't have the same penetration of society and logical properties as they have in another region. So it ought to be useful, assuming you're working in the world as a whole and you're needing to, in some sense, have bureaucratic procedures that standardize your policies and that justify your allocation of resources between regions. It ought to be helpful then to have appropriately nuanced, contextualized regional explanations, which are not simply saying, my case is so special, nothing from anywhere else applies, but which says, my case is special in these ways, which are really important for you to take into account in order to see how your agency will be able to work in this context as opposed to some other. It seems to me there is a practical, necessary practical implication. I also wanted to make two points as the non-German in the room, one of the non-Germans in the room, that a lot of the discussion we've had is using things like Freedom House, Polity 4, one can go on with many, many of the standard universalist tools. Actually, I think it's an important feature of Germany that it has produced, they're not so centrally used by academia, but they have it. Let me give two examples. Transparency International provides us with a set of tools which are obviously very policy related, because you need to know how corrupt or what the perceptions of corruption are in the places that you're dealing with in order to understand whether the institutions are workable or not that are your counterparts. And that's a German that's based in Berlin and has a certain added credibility because it's not the United States judging everybody else's. So that's and another one which is quite relevant for us is the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, particularly when we're talking about institutional change, because the Bertelsmann Transformation Index doesn't do what the Freedom House does, which is say, everywhere in the world there is a standard of freedom that ought to apply. How close to that standard of freedom is this country or that? It says, let's look at those countries where transformation is underway. Mainly, we're talking about countries moving from closed economies and non-market, non-democracies towards. And now let's see how much progress they're making in change. Not where they are by some absolute standard, but what changes towards the goals of transformation. And that produces quite different ratings, because you may be a country that doesn't rate very highly on Freedom House or on transparency, but you may be a country at the same time which is making a lot of progress given where you started from. That's relevant to our sort of peacekeeping, post-conflict kind of issues, for example. And that redefinition, or that shift in the criteria of measurement, and that focusing in on institutional change and on state building and on democracy building, is something which, well, in this case, the Bertelsmann Foundation is contributing, which is enriching the range of instruments we have. So, and those I think are very useful for practitioners, and they are practitioner-related questions. That's why they were being added to the set of tools. And then finally, just, if you look at the success of the European Union in bringing about institutional transformation among those countries that joined the European Union, the Copenhagen criteria and all of that, I know there are limitations to that process, but here is a very powerful, long-run, cumulative example of a certain kind of policy transformations that you wanted to bring about, that you were able to help and incentivize people to achieve, and that you were able also to do it in a not imposed colonial, the army says you've got to do this kind of way. That was a considerable achievement, but it was limited to that region where states could be incentivized because they could enter the EU. So now let's take another region which is of equal or very great interest to the European Union. Let's call it the Middle East. But the Middle East states, we want them to go in the same direction. We have the same ideas about the sort of help we should give them. Only problem is they can't join the European Union. So now, what do? Well, we see that institutional design, and basically the European Union produced the Barcelona process. And the Barcelona process proved remarkably ineffective by comparison with the Copenhagen criteria. So there are some lessons we can draw from that, which are both about regional differentiation, there's a very clear regional contrast that we can carry out there, but also about what kinds of assistance in transformational policies produce what kind of effects, and what kinds are, for what reasons. Well, we'll then have to look at the institutional criteria affecting the donor organizations, and not only the recipients. The donors also have their institutional peculiarities, but my feeling is that that's a way of bringing your concerns into line with the kind of cross-regional comparative work that we're discussing.
I'm still wondering whether the Bertelsmann Transformation Index is free of any ethnocentric vision of the world, the end goals being market and democracy. That sounds still very Eurocentric.
I didn't say that it was beyond reproach, any more than I think Freedom House is on reproach, or indeed the Transparency Index, or indeed Polity4, or any of these ratings. There's still a separate area of debate we should have about who has the right to define what kind of goals and what kind of instruments are appropriate for pursuing goals. I'm only saying that in a world where we were suffering from a very, very narrow set of post-1990 measurement indicators, it's better to have more. Now, it may still be that they're too ethnocentric, and if the Turkish government manages to produce a set of instruments for evaluation which are not Bertelsmann but following different criteria, we can triangulate between those.
Yeah, thanks. Ariel, your take on this?
I come to this, I guess, from a different perspective. I'm a political scientist who lives and works in Washington, D.C. And so what I hear in Washington, D.C., and it's really emerged again after a few years of hiatus of a discussion about what can political scientists do about bridging the gap to policymakers. It was a few months ago. I won't talk about why that reappeared on the menu for discussion, but it was, if anyone went to the Bridging the Gap reception at ISA, it was a nice party. I have my own doubts about whether American policymakers want better social science to begin with, whether even if it were provided, if they would want to have it. But for GIGA, I think GIGA is in a unique position. Looking at it from an American perspective, I can't think of a similar kind of institution that would exist in the United States. And I think GIGA is uniquely well positioned to be providing to do the kind of work that American policymakers say that they want to have. Generating a policy relevance in two different scales. First, through training and education, so generating people who have advanced degrees and advanced training, and secondly, generating research that has real policy relevance, that is focused on questions that are of policy importance. I think that comparative area studies, CIS, as a undertaking is especially important in generating that kind of policy relevance, for a couple of reasons. First, because it does not necessarily stem from the mind of a single person. This is one of the complaints about academic writing, is that it's usually driven by social science writing. It's driven by one or two people, and one or two people can only do so much. And so there's a kind of narrowness to social science research that comparative area studies and GIGA is able to overcome institutionally and theoretically. To my way of thinking, the most significant part of comparative area studies as a contribution for policymaking is in its ability to capture general trends, but also pay attention to and theorize the outlier cases. We have the tendency, particularly for economics, and I don't mean to pick on economists, but the tendency, especially in the more quantitative fields, is to focus on the general trend, and the outlier cases remain as residuals. There are one or two cases that we simply don't know very much about, and we'll leave them. They're not important. I think the comparative area studies forces you to consider not just what the general trend is, but also to think about the outliers. Why are they outliers? I'm a Middle East specialist. Why was the Middle East so authoritarian for so long? Comparative area studies gives you a vehicle to do that we don't that at least in the United States, we don't have a vocabulary to really engage that kind of question effectively, collaboratively, and interdisciplinarily.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel.